Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirard. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
So on this episode of the Disrupt Your Career podcast, I am delighted to be welcoming Celeste Warren. She's a diversity and inclusion advocate and consultant. She's a leader, she's a speaker, and she's a published author. We're going to learn a lot more about her as we go through things. But Celeste, first of all, just thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Claire, for the invitation. And I'm so happy to be here and talk about a lot of different things in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space.
So let's start, as we usually do, with your career journey. You've been through several pivots and challenges in your career, whether you specialized early in HR at organizations such as Kraft or Merck. Until just a few years ago, you had spent over 25 years rising to the role of Global VP for Diversity and Inclusion at big pharma company Merck. And just recently, you set up as an independent consultant in the diversity and inclusion field and became the author of a book with a very long title, The Truth About Equity, What It Really Is, What It Isn't, and Why Everyone Wins When We Get It Right. So please do share with us how this extraordinary career has unfolded. I'd love to understand the relative importance of design and serendipity, and to understand what the high points have been, as well as the moments of challenge.
I actually started out my career as a reporter, believe it or not. When I graduated from undergraduate, I was a reporter in Lexington, Kentucky. I went to school at the University of Kentucky. Did that for just a few years, 2 or 3 years, not that long. But all through my young formative years, elementary school, junior high, high school, and then in university, I wanted to be a reporter. That's all I wanted to be. And then when I actually became one, I did a lot of things in high school, school newspaper, stuff like that, and in college as well. But when I actually became a professional reporter after graduation, I went to a mid-career crisis. And so that is an industry where 10% of the people are making 90% of the money, and the other 90% of the people in the industry are only making 10% of the money. And I got tired of writing home to my parents and saying, I need money for rent and this and that. And so I decided to switch careers, went back to grad school, and then was introduced to the field of human resources. Didn't really want to do it at first because my perceptions of the field was myopic. Let's just put it that way, and wrong. My world was just opened up, my eyes opened up, and I decided to pursue it. And I have always pursued different positions. Let me backtrack. I haven't pursued positions. I pursued challenges and opportunities that met my curiosity and learning background and foundation, because I always like to learn. I don't like to go into a role that's just stagnant. I like to go into a role where there are challenges, where there are things that need to happen, whether it's building, whether it's turning around an organization or something like that. And I've always done it through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I did it through a lens of who are we leaving behind? How can we be more inclusive? What do people need in order to optimize their level of performance? And different people need different things. And that's kind of how I've looked at my HR career. So it was a sort of a natural progression, really, when I look back on it 10 years ago, to go into this chief diversity inclusion role, because that's how I viewed my career anyway, looking through it through that lens. I didn't want to do it, Claire. It was literally the third time that I was asked that I finally said, okay, yes, I'll take on the challenge. Because when I was coming up through the different positions, I was enjoying it. I had responsibility for a certain group, organization, and I was able to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. I had a great relationship with my, lead client leader, and we were just going and moving and shaking and doing a lot of different things in the respective organization, whoever I was partnered with. And I had the great fortune to be partnered with people who we wanted to make change in the organization. And so I was happy. And I always considered myself an HR generalist, if you will, an HR business partner. And so when I was asked to take over this center of excellence, I just didn't see myself as a specialist. I didn't see myself. But then I took all of the things that I had learned as an HR leader, change management, organizational design, influencing and impacting, and business acumen. I took all of those skills and capabilities with me into this role. And I tell you, Claire, if ever it was tested to understand how to do all of those skill sets in a different type of a role, it was in this role. Some of the high points throughout my career, I was the head of HR for an organization. It was a new role. And I said, I like to take on challenges. But one of the roles I stepped into was right after our merger, Merck's merger with Shearing Plow back in 2009. And I was put in a role that didn't exist prior to that with our vaccine business. So there was a vaccine research that reported into the research organization, vaccine manufacturing that reported into manufacturing organization, and vaccine sales and commercial that reported into that organization. And my task was, you need to bring all three of those organizations together to lead Merck's vaccine business. The three leaders reported to three different leaders. It was quite a task. So getting them to think as one business unit together, leading that business, it was the epitome of change management, redesigning what their thoughts around leadership, culture change for not just them, but them bringing their leaders together. Because I started with the three of them and then brought all of their leadership teams together. And that construct and that infrastructure created back in 2010 still exists in the company today. So it was one of the high points of my career as an HR leader and business partner working with those leaders. And then I guess the second part would be just stepping into the role as a GD&I Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence leader.
Beautiful. Well, those are some impressive positions and impacts to reflect on as you move forward. I just wanted to maybe mention the fact that I see you very clearly from an individual point of view, that shift between wanting to be a reporter and tell stories, and then actually moving into helping people create their stories. There's a strong connection. And I spent all of my years up to my final year at university thinking I was going to be Christiane Amanpour Mark II. But for different reasons, I stepped away from that. But isn't it interesting how these things do cross over, even if they don't necessarily look remotely similar from outside? But we've probably got a conversation to be had offline at some point about all the different aspects of that. In the meantime, I'm thinking about how in these different bits of Merck and the other organizations you've been in, you've held roles that have clearly had a big strategic importance, which I can only imagine meant that you've been working hand in hand with impressive leaders of different kinds. And I'd love to know what sort of standout lessons you've gleaned from them.
I can remember working with a leader in sales and marketing organization earlier on in my career. And one of the things that he taught me, he was a huge diversity and inclusion ally. And I mean an active ally. I remember one day being frustrated. I was in my office and I was a little bit frustrated at the fact that the sales leaders weren't understanding the importance of having a diverse and inclusive management team across the nation. They were in different parts of the country. And in those different parts of the country, there was a huge diversity in the patient base, in the physician base, from the standpoint of the hills of Virginia to the urban centers of Washington, D.C. and New York, et cetera. I was a business leader. My discipline was around people, optimizing the performance of people. And so I was just frustrated. I was sitting in my office and he came in and he said, what's wrong? How can I help? And I told him what was going on. And I said, they're just not understanding how they can really maximize their business if they would just have more diversity on their teams, because they're going to be able to understand beyond the pill, beyond the vial, beyond the marketing materials, understand what's getting in the way of patients being able to experience the health outcomes that we want them to experience. And those things do not involve the essence of the product. It involves what we call the social determinants of health, the things that you have to understand, the cultures and the life experiences of your patients and of the physicians and what they're going through. And you can't really interpret what you think they're going through. You need to have people who walk in their shoes, who understand that culture, who are from that, have similar life experiences. And he said, okay. He said, well, what do you think we should do? And I love the fact that he said we. He didn't say, what do you think you should do? Further even solidifying our partnership. And I said, what I think that we could do is we need to help them to understand the importance of it. And I told him, I said, I really do need your help. And he said, he said, the organization, sometimes they're good soldiers. And if you tell them what is important and what you want them to do, then they'll do it. And he said, and it's not so much a heavy handing, I want you to do this, I want you to do that. He goes, if I just, during my meetings with them, if I just simply drop questions and ask questions about, well, can you talk to me about such and such area and what some of the challenges are? And well, do you think that might be helped if maybe they were talking with someone who understood the challenges that they were facing from the standpoint of their culture? So he basically, we went into his leadership meeting that next week, and he was asking these questions, not in a heavy-handed way, but just asking them as they were giving their updates. And Claire, it made such an impact because all of a sudden they were smart people. And as sales leaders who had come up through the sales organization, they knew how to read people and how to, you know what I mean? That finesse and understanding of people from that perspective. They knew where he was going as by the questions that he was asking. And I tell you, it didn't take long for them to understand the importance of it. And then I was able to come in and give them the resources, the coaching, the counseling to understand how they go about it. And it taught me throughout my career, ask the right questions. You don't have to come down heavy handed, but just ask the right questions to get them to think about what you need them to do, what they should be doing, and meet them where they are.
That is absolutely stunning as a story. And, the epitome of great leadership and collaboration. So thank you, whoever it was. Thank you for the work. Let's come back to you and your career. Obviously, you might say it's been characterized by longevity of all kinds, but nevertheless, clearly you've made transitions of all kinds within that. What would be the most challenging and disruptive transition you've ever made from one context to another?
It was the transition from being an HR business partner to being a specialist and doing it at a senior C-suite level. There's one thing to do it when you're earlier on in your career, you can learn from your mistakes, grow, etc. But there's another thing when you're doing it at a vice president C-suite level where all eyes are on you and you want to try to not make as many mistakes. You can't not make mistakes. I made plenty of mistakes and missteps throughout this 10-year journey as the company chief diversity inclusion officer. For me, it was like, okay, I'm on this stage now. I'm in this role. I'm switching sort of the framework of how I fundamentally was brought up as being an HR leader and now switching over here and doing it at a level where all eyes were on me. And so, what that was very nerve-wracking, challenging, anxiety-ridden, all of that. And especially too, because I was someone who was just extremely passionate about it. And so it's something that was ingrained in me since I was a little girl growing up in Western Pennsylvania, a small steel mill town where my father was the first Black teacher and principal. And so every day at dinner time, when my mom would ask that question, how was your day? We got a lesson in the importance of diversity and inclusion and equity. And he raised us to be the type of people where You don't just complain about it, you do something about it. And I learned that through him in these conversations, in the dinner table conversations. I had this challenge. Here's what I did about it. So that's kind of been my framework. And so, there were a lot of frustrating times in this role. Not everyone had the same passion that I did. Not everyone had the same skill set that I had. And I had to really make sure that I wasn't getting to a level of frustration where that frustration was shining through to the people that I was trying to reach. That was incredibly, incredibly important. If you're trying to communicate and you're trying to influence and make an impact on someone to change behavior, mindset, etc., you can't sit there and have some mode of communication where they don't receive it. Your job is to make sure that they receive the information that you're trying to relay to them. And so that was hard for me. I had a lot of white knuckle moments where my hands are clenched and I'm sitting there trying to say, "Don't you get it? Don't you get it?" But you can't be that way outwardly. In my mind, I could be having all those conversations
Indeed.
with myself. I had to make sure that that wasn't coming through because you can't make an impact. You can't influence people. You can't get them to change their mindsets and behaviors if you aren't reaching them where they are and making sure that your message is clear.
A very, very difficult balance to find, but it sounds as though you did well and in the teetering, but getting in the right direction fundamentally. Beautiful. Let's think for a moment, with all this accumulated wisdom and experience, what advice do you have for early career professionals who are looking to start out?
One, you have to stay relevant. So keep up your skills, your capabilities. That's very important because in this day and age, roles are changing. Jobs that exist today didn't exist even 5 or 10 years ago. When I think about an influencer,
Yes,
10 years ago, you're like,
I
what
know.
is,
Yeah, exactly. You'd have
what?
laughed, right?
You can
Yes.
make money by sitting home and just being on social media and influencing people. But I would say that, to the person earlier in their career, stay relevant in whatever discipline that you're in, stay relevant. Understand what the organizational needs are, whether it's an engineer, a scientist, a sales, marketing, IT, doesn't make a difference. But understand where the organization that you're a part of, where they're going, and the industry, where it's going, and make sure that you stay relevant because you want to be that person. If they're picking people to be on the island, that you're one of the people that is picked because of your knowledge, your skills, your capabilities is very, very important. Also, too, don't shy away from who you are and your identity. Because in this day and age, any strong business strategy understands that they need to understand their customers. They need to understand the customer segmentation. They need to understand the markets. And however you identify, being able to bring not just your functional skills and capabilities to the table, but also being able to bring your cultural awareness and your life experiences to be able to share in that as well. That's really, really important. And a lot of young people don't realize that. They think they have to mimic a C-suite leader and being smart and in having the skills and capabilities from their functional approach. But you have to also be able to bring your authentic self. And part of that is being able to look at a strategy or look at something and say, is that really going to meet the needs of this type of person or that type of customer or this person that's living here or has this lifestyle or et cetera. And that's from a global perspective. You have to have that perspective. And then the last thing I would say is be yourself. You're in a role, whether you're in office or you're remote, it doesn't make a difference. Whether your office is the screen of your computer, you're working there for 8, 9 hours a day, some 10, some 11. Taking all of that time to be somebody who you're not,
It's very, very tiring, isn't it?
energy. Oh
Yes.
my God, it's extremely tiring. And by the time you do turn off your laptop or that commute home, you're so exhausted because of what you've had to do and what you feel you have to do. So when you're interviewing, when you walk into a role, starting from the interview, be yourself. Be yourself. That way, when you walk into the role, you're not changing based on who you were in the interview and who you are when you walk through the doors of the corporation.
That's so powerful as advice. And the number of people that act their way into roles. And I've done it. I remember doing it early on in my career. It never
We
works out.
all have.
It
We
never
all
works
have.
out well. Definitely. Let's now talk about this new book that you've recently written and published, The Truth About Equity. That's the short version, right? Which is about equality versus equity. This question of, what the difference is between the two. I'm sure the audience all has their different perceptions about what it might be, but I'd love to hear your version, and particularly what led you to write the book initially.
What led me to write the book was over the past, I would say, 2 or 3 years, we've seen, especially in the United States and in some countries, where there's such a divisiveness in political views and in ideology and perspectives. And instead of people respecting those differences, and in some ways celebrating them and treating people with dignity and respect based on, the fact that you may think a little bit differently than I do. There's just been this complete polarization and this divisiveness in many, many countries. And so I'm sitting there and I'm just watching this as a leader in diversity and inclusion, seeing it not just within my organization, but also across the landscape globally. It sort of hit a crescendo when I saw different things happening, October 7th and what happened Israel and Gaza. Then what sparked that conversation, that dialogue, what happened there. The ongoing war with Ukraine and Russia and the polarization there. And not just through the eyes of those individuals who are citizens of those countries in those areas, but around the world, the global debate that it sparked around the world, the things that are happening in the United States. It was such a disheartening for me because equity and diversity and inclusion were starting to get weaponized. There wasn't just misinformation about it. There was disinformation where it was purposeful, planful, strategic misinformation, wrong information about what it really is. I knew I'd been planning my retirement for about 18 months, 2 years to 18 months. And through that time of bringing in my successor, getting them ready to take on the role, I announced my retirement and my successor in February of this year. From that point, I stepped back and I worked full time on a task force, an executive task force, working with the CEO on how do we put together a strategy, an integrated strategy to mitigate any risk as a result of this administration to our U.S. business. It was unlike any type of work that I had done because usually when you say you're going to set a strategy, you have current state and you have, what's desired state, and then you plot the path from A to Z, right? Well, Z or desired state, it was so up in the air because every day something was changing.
Something would change.
Something was coming up. News breaks were, coming up. And so I had to really think about it from the perspective of, okay, how do I make sure that we mitigate risk? How do I make sure that we don't lose the credibility from an employee standpoint? And then third was, how do we navigate all of the social media things that were happening as well to add insult to injury, right? And then there was also a component of the work that I had done over the 10 years was to really make sure that we had a global approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because when I got in the job 10 years ago, it was pretty much basically in the US. And then there were a few sprinkles across different parts of Europe or something like that. But I put a strategy together to say, how do we make sure that we have a global approach to diversity, equity, inclusion? So made huge, huge progress in that space. And I was concerned because my colleagues across in the different countries were then reaching out to me and saying, Celeste, this stuff is happening in the United States. what impact is that going to have on us? What impact is that going to have? Because we want to keep continuing to push forward with the work that we're doing. And so all of that was sort of playing, that we had to make sure that we had the strategy in place, working with the other leaders and making sure that all of this was happening from a global perspective. And I tell you, it was hard, but it was very, very rewarding from the standpoint at the very end of the work before I retired. We take employee engagement surveys, pulse surveys, what we called them. And at the very end, right before I retired, there was another pulse survey. And I was really concerned of the work that we were doing to mitigate risk and how that was impacting. We had a huge, huge change in communication strategy in place as well with our internal employees, making sure that we were keeping them abreast of what we were doing, if we were making any changes, instilling in them that diversity, equity, inclusion were the foundational values of the organization, just like dignity and respect. And it wasn't going away. It was important to our people, our culture, our business. When we took the pulse survey, one of the top questions that had been in previous years, but it remained one of the top questions was, my management embraces diversity and inclusion. That was still the top one through all of this. And that sort of let me know that, okay, Celeste, you did it right. You were able to, mitigate risk during this period because it was a very volatile period. And you were able to make sure that your global colleagues knew that they needed to continue to keep doing the work you're doing because, it's a saying, when in Rome, you do as in Rome, making sure that they understood this was a U.S. construct. This executive order was U.S. It was not impacting any laws or regulations within your respective country. And then making sure that we had that global engagement of the employees was just very, very critical. And we did it in a way, a lot of companies had a lot of knee-jerk reactions. As soon as January 22nd came and the administration was in place and all the executive orders came out, there were a lot of knee-jerk reactions, companies, turning on a dime. And that wasn't the right way that you needed to approach it. You needed to approach it from observing, listening, trying to understand, and slowly making any changes that you needed to based on the law. And that was really, really important. And the communications piece was very important too. Leaders were, what should I say? What can I say? What can I not say? What can I do? What can I not do? And making sure that they understood that the essence of what we do is critically important. And that's where the learnings from the previous story that I told about asking the right questions. I remember I was at a leadership team meeting with our US market. And they asked me, well, Celeste, what can I say? What can I not say? And I said, what work have you been doing all along so you understand what it is that you're doing? So you tell me, what is it that you've been doing and why have you been doing it? And when I turned it around to them and they started talking about it through their experience in diversity and inclusion, and I said, then that's what you say. I shouldn't have to give you words or this or that. If you say the word equity, the equity police is going to come down from the ceiling and tell you, and fire you or anything like that. So it was getting people to talk through their hearts and through their passions as opposed to wondering what they can't say. And just making sure our leaders outside of the United States understood, keep doing, keep going, implement your strategies, implement your initiatives, because this does not impact you.
I love that. And from that sprang the book.
The book was my therapy, Claire.
Beautiful, wonderful.
Very therapeutic from that standpoint. So there was such a level of frustration that I had. I had to get it out some way, some shape and form. And I did it through this book and writing this book, putting my thoughts, on a page, talking about the importance of it, trying to dispel and be that same voice in a forest of misinformation and disinformation, helping people to understand the essence of what it is. It's good leadership, it's good management, it's good business to be able to understand equity. It's meeting people where they are and saying, what do you need to succeed?
How does the rocks and fence analogy that you and effectively explain equity. I'd love to understand more about that and how we should be aspiring to build this kind of thinking into our own leadership, wherever we are and whoever we are.
So I use this illustration. It was created by Deloitte. The way I talk about it is in the first illustration, it talks about equality where everyone is standing on one rock, but the person on the right, they can't see over the fence still. The person in the middle can barely see over the fence. The person on the left can clearly see over the fence. In the second analogy, the person on the right is standing on 3 rocks, the person in the middle on 2 rocks. And those rocks are acts of equity. You're giving people what they need so they can see over that fence. And that fence, in my analogy, are all of the longer term isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, all of those different classism, all of those isms that they've cropped up over, in some cases, centuries, decades. And they're going to take a longer term strategy to try to dismantle and tear down and pull apart from our institutions and systems, et cetera. And so while we're doing that work, we're putting those acts of equity in place. So having leadership programs that focus on the perspectives of women and the challenges that they have in the workplace. So what's happening? This work of equity is causing disruption because the person who was standing on one rock in the first illustration and is standing on one rock in the second illustration, they're looking to their right and they're saying, well, how come that person has 3 rocks and that person has 2 rocks and I only have 1? That's not fair. That's not inclusion. That's exclusion. That's preferential treatment. And what they don't understand is that fence is there. And they don't understand how that fence manifests itself in the workplace, in educational, in society to the persons on the right. They don't understand the marginalization. They don't understand it because they've always been able to see over the fence. And so what we have to do, and I think for whatever reason, not intentional, but we need to do a better job of having conversations with that person that's standing on one rock so they understand why those rocks are needed, so they understand how those isms manifest themselves to the people to his right, that they understand that that fence is there and has been there for a long time, and then get them, not just explaining them, giving them resources and things to help them to build their intellectual knowledge, but also getting them to be active allies, getting them in the boat, grabbing an oar and helping us to row to shore. That's what the work that needs to be done simultaneously. Putting the acts of equity in place, which are the more short-term, mid-term strategies, tearing down the fence, which is the longer-term strategies, and then having those sometimes difficult conversations, but I like to call them bold, inclusive conversations with the person standing on the one rock so they understand the work that has to be done and they join with us and help us to do the work. That's what needs to happen. All of that. It's a multi-pronged strategy and approach that you have to take in order to do this work. And it's not easy. It's very, very, very hard. There's no getting around that. But it's critically important that that's the way it's done because then you get to the third illustration where you don't need the rocks, the fence is torn down, everybody can see the beautiful mountains in front because that impacts everybody. And that's the whole point about how equity benefits everyone when we get it right and we do all of the work that needs to happen. Because even in that case where the fence is torn down, the person that was standing on the one rock, all of a sudden you notice that there was a fence there and now it's gone because now I can see not just the tops of the mountain, but I can still see everything all around.
That's wonderful. Thank you for going into such depth into that metaphor because it really is a brilliant explanation and also a wonderful vision. I suspect I know the answer to your next question, which is torn down fences. But nevertheless, I'm going to ask you, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about the world of work, what would it be?
Oh, wow. If I had a magic wand, I would really like to tear down that fence by opening up the knowledge, the aperture, if you will, of C-suite leaders, and then also managers of when they started becoming, even before they became managers, as individual leaders, individual contributors, where these things were starting to shape their mindsets, their behaviors, because they learn from not just their early childhood. It comes up from that standpoint. But when you get into in type of an organization, you see how leaders behave. And in some cases, you say, well, if I aspire to be a leader, I guess I got to behave that way. And that's sad, but that assimilation does play in the back of your mind if you're aspiring to get into the C-suite. And so if I had a magic wand, I would, as someone is becoming a leader, a manager, a first line supervisor, we thought it was like a car wash, that they could go through the car wash. And
I love it.
all of these things that get in the way of it being a more inclusive environment, a more equitable environment, that goes away from that person when they come through the car wash and they're a manager. That would be great if we had that. It's sort of like, when you say, well, I wish I could put that in a pill.
I'm keeping that car wash image, that's for sure. It's a great one, definitely. Let's keep on thinking and working towards that for sure. Coming back to you and your projects, we've got, I want to say the second half. Let's pretend that we still have a half of 2025 left. And next year, what are the most exciting things on the horizon for you as you go forward in this new phase?
I am really, really excited about the book tour, of being able to talk with colleagues such as yourself and helping to explain, equity, the importance of it, what it really is, understanding that it's leadership 101, management 101, business 101, and helping people to understand it from a very simplistic point of view. I'm putting together a strategy with a colleague of mine to say, it's sort of like organizational change, but doing it outside of an organization and looking at the world and saying, okay, if I were to segment the population of this world, who do I need to reach? How do I reach them? What's the best vehicle? So we can start to get them. We may not change their minds. Anyone that knows organizational change and change management, there's 10% of the people you're just not going to change their mind, no matter what you do. And that's fine. But how can I get to that other 80, 90% and help them to think a little bit differently about clickbait, about the headlines, about the misinformation that's out there, and think critically, think intellectually, think critically and passionately as well. Hopefully it'll lead to that, around what they can be doing to meet people where they are and bring them forward. And I want people to have dialogues, productive dialogues around this subject. And yeah, we may agree to disagree and go our own ways, and that's fine. But as long as we do it under a foundation of dignity and respect, that's it. So I am planning on laying out that sort of strategic framework of where do I need to go to reach people to get this message across? Because I think it's really, really critical.
That's an absolutely wonderfully audacious horizon to be opening up, Celeste. Thank you for doing that. Thank you also for joining me today. I know we could go on for a long, long time more on all these topics, but you've really brought some new light and new energy to this space. And we wish you the very best with that. And I just want to thank you for sharing so openly and so passionately.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed talking with you.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.